There is a version of the Cold War that most people carry in their heads, assembled from documentaries and history classes and the occasional museum exhibit about the space race. It is a version in which two great powers stared at each other across a divided world for roughly 4 decades, each holding the other in check through the mutual certainty of destruction, until one of them simply ran out of resources, and the whole arrangement came to a conclusion that felt, in retrospect, almost peaceful. The wall came down. The flags changed. Some statues were pulled off their pedestals. The world moved on. The Cold War did not end. It paused. That distinction matters more than almost anyone in a position of authority has ever been willing to say out loud. And the reason it matters is because the technologies developed during those decades were not dismantled when the flags came down and the treaties were signed. They were archived. Some were mothballed. Some were quietly handed off to successor programs with different names and the same logic embedded in their design. And the logic was simple. Assume the enemy will strike first. Assume the warning will be incomplete. Assume the human operator will hesitate, and build systems that compensate for every one of those assumptions simultaneously. What most people believe about the Cold War is a story assembled from the parts that were allowed to surface. The Berlin Wall, the Cuban Missile Crisis as a 13-day drama with a clean resolution, arms races measured in warhead counts, spy swaps on foggy bridges. These events are real, but they function in public memory as a kind of controlled release, a narrative managed well enough to suggest that the conflict had shape and boundaries, and that the people in charge understood what they were doing. The classified record suggests something different. It suggests a conflict that was, at its operational level, almost entirely procedural, a machinery of deterrence that ran on contingency plans and automated thresholds and institutional inertia, and that came far closer to autonomous escalation than either government ever acknowledged to its own citizens. This is not a story about villains. The scientists and engineers and military planners who built these systems were, by every available account, serious and intelligent people doing what they believed was necessary. The horror of what they created is not that it reflected malice. It is that it reflected competence, applied without limit to a problem that had no clean solution. You cannot deter a nuclear-armed adversary without threatening mass destruction. You cannot maintain a credible threat of mass destruction without building systems capable of delivering it automatically. You cannot build systems capable of automatic delivery without accepting that those systems might, under the right conditions, operate without authorization. Every step in that chain was logical. The chain itself was not. The 19 technologies described in this narration were not the most famous weapons of the Cold War. They were not the ones displayed at air shows or described in congressional testimony or featured in the arms control agreements that were meant to demonstrate restraint. Most of them were classified for decades. Some remain partially classified. A few were not acknowledged to exist until the governments that built them had already determined that acknowledgement posed less risk than continued denial. What connects all of them is that each one was designed to function at the edge of human decision-making or beyond it, and that each one existed within a system so large and so compartmentalized that no single person, including the presidents and general secretaries nominally in charge of it, fully understood what was operational at any given moment. The first of these technologies was a listening system, and it was not listening for the things its name suggested. The United States Navy began deploying hydrophone arrays on the ocean floor in the early 1950s under a program called SOSUS, which stood for Sound Surveillance System. The public version of this history describes it as a submarine detection network, which is accurate as far as it goes. What the public version tends not to emphasize is what the system was actually designed to do once it detected something. SOSUS did not simply record the positions of Soviet submarines. It fed that data into targeting systems. It was, from its inception, not a passive intelligence tool, but an active component of the Navy's warfighting infrastructure. The hydrophone arrays stretched across the Atlantic and Pacific floors, connected by cables to shore stations that processed acoustic signatures around the clock. By the late 1950s, SOSUS could track Soviet submarines across ocean basins with a precision that Soviet naval planners did not know was possible. This asymmetry was significant. Soviet submarines carried ballistic missiles. If those submarines could be located and targeted before they launched, then the threat they represented could theoretically be neutralized in a first strike. The existence of SOSUS meant that the United States had a capability that incentivized preemption. It also meant that when Soviet planners eventually learned, through their own intelligence operations, that their submarine fleet was less survivable than they had believed, the discovery increased their own pressure to launch earlier in a crisis, before that capability could be fully exploited. A system designed for defense had created conditions that made offensive action more rational. This was not an accident. It was a structural feature of deterrence logic, and it repeated itself across nearly every major weapons program of the era. The second technology was the B-52 bomber, but not the aircraft itself, which was well known and publicly acknowledged. What was not publicly acknowledged was the posture in which those aircraft operated from the late 1950s through 1968. Under a program called Chrome Dome, the Strategic Air Command kept a rotating airborne alert of B-52s, each armed with nuclear weapons, in the air at all times. Not on the ground on alert status, in the air. The aircraft flew continuous routes near Soviet airspace, carrying live thermonuclear bombs, ready to receive an encoded attack order and proceed to their targets without landing first. The rationale was survivability. Ground-based bombers were vulnerable to a surprise Soviet missile strike. An aircraft already in the air could not be destroyed on the ground. The logic was sound within the framework of deterrence. The operational reality was that nuclear-armed aircraft were flying over the Arctic, over Greenland, over the Atlantic, every hour of every day for roughly a decade. There were accidents. In January 1961, a B-52 broke apart over Goldsboro, North Carolina. 2 Mark 39 hydrogen bombs fell to Earth. One of them, according to documents declassified decades later, went through several of its arming sequence steps before the final safeguard held. In January 1966, a B-52 collided with a tanker aircraft over Palomares, Spain. 4 hydrogen bombs fell to the ground and into the sea. 3 were recovered on land. 1 required a months-long underwater search. In January 1968, a B-52 crashed near Thule Air Base in Greenland. The conventional explosives in its 4 nuclear weapons detonated on impact, scattering plutonium across the sea ice. The Chrome Dome program was quietly ended after the Thule accident. The official explanation focused on cost and aircraft wear. The more complete explanation was that the accident rate had made the program's continuation politically untenable. What was not discussed publicly was how close at Goldsboro the procedural safeguards had come to failing entirely. The third technology was a communication system designed to survive nuclear attack, and its survival was predicated on the destruction of everything else. The military networks that would eventually evolve into what civilians now use for ordinary communication were built, in their earliest form, as a command and control infrastructure that could continue to function after a nuclear exchange had destroyed conventional communication links. The Advanced Research Projects Agency began funding this work in the early 1960s, and the design philosophy that emerged from it was specifically intended to route signals around damaged nodes in a network. What this meant in practice was a system with no central point of failure, which meant a system with no central point of control. The designers understood this. They built it anyway, because the alternative was a command and control infrastructure that could be decapitated in a first strike, leaving surviving military forces without orders, which created its own set of catastrophic possibilities. The tension between controllability and survivability was never resolved. It was managed, which is a different thing. The systems that descended from this early work eventually became so embedded in both military and civilian infrastructure that the distinction between the two largely ceased to exist, creating vulnerabilities that neither the original designers nor their successors fully mapped. The fourth technology was a satellite reconnaissance program so sensitive that its existence was not officially acknowledged by the United States government until 1992, more than 3 decades after its first operational flights. The Corona program launched its first successful film return satellite in August 1960, and the photographs it brought back provided more intelligence on Soviet military installations in a single mission than all previous U-2 overflights combined. What the public did not know, and what the Soviet government knew but could not publicly acknowledge without admitting the extent of their own surveillance failures, was that American satellites were photographing Soviet territory in systematic detail on a continuous basis throughout the 1960s. The significance of this asymmetry cannot be overstated. American military planners had access to imagery that showed the actual disposition of Soviet forces, the locations of missile sites, the construction status of military installations. Soviet planners, for much of this period, were working from intelligence that was far less complete. This gap in situational awareness shaped arms control negotiations in ways that neither side could acknowledge openly, because acknowledging it would have required admitting the existence of the program. The Corona satellites and their successors were not simply intelligence tools. They were a structural advantage that distorted the strategic balance in ways that the public record of the Cold War does not reflect. The fifth technology was a weapons system that combined 2 of the most politically sensitive capabilities in the American nuclear arsenal and deployed them in a configuration that no treaty formally addressed. The nuclear depth charge was an anti-submarine weapon designed to destroy Soviet submarines by detonating a nuclear warhead at depth. The concept was straightforward. A conventional depth charge had a limited kill radius. A nuclear depth charge could destroy a submarine over a much larger area, compensating for the imprecision of underwater targeting. What made this weapon particularly significant was its deployment context. Nuclear depth charges were carried by surface ships and anti-submarine aircraft, which operated under rules of engagement that, during periods of elevated tension, could authorize their use based on tactical commanders' judgments about submarine threats. The threshold for using a nuclear weapon in an anti-submarine role was, operationally, lower than the threshold for strategic nuclear release. A naval officer tracking a Soviet submarine in hostile waters had authority, under some versions of the operational plans, to use nuclear weapons in a way that a strategic air command bomber crew did not. Whether this authority was ever exercised, or how close it came to being exercised during the Cuban Missile Crisis, or the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, or any of the other naval confrontations of the period, is a question the available declassified record does not fully answer. The sixth technology was a missile defense system, but not the one that appeared in public debate. The Soviet Union deployed a nuclear-armed anti-ballistic missile system around Moscow beginning in the mid-1960s. The Galosh interceptor was designed to destroy incoming American warheads by detonating its own nuclear warhead in the upper atmosphere, creating a blast sufficient to destroy or disable the incoming re-entry vehicles. The publicly discussed version of Soviet missile defense emphasized its limitations, which were real, and its political significance in the context of SALT negotiations, which was also real. What received less public attention was the operational logic of nuclear-armed interceptors. A nuclear explosion in the upper atmosphere above Moscow would generate electromagnetic pulse effects and radiation effects that would affect not only the incoming warheads, but also communications infrastructure, aircraft, and potentially the Moscow command and control network itself. The weapon designed to protect the city contained within its operational use a significant probability of disrupting the city's ability to function in the immediate aftermath of an attack. This contradiction was understood by the engineers who designed the system. It was accepted because the alternative, allowing incoming warheads to reach Moscow without interception, was considered worse. The calculation was not wrong, but it illustrated a pattern that ran through virtually every major weapons program of the Cold War. Systems designed to reduce risk contained within their design new categories of risk that their designers accepted as necessary costs. The seventh technology was a targeting database so large and so detailed that the document describing it, when it was finally declassified in 2015, ran to nearly 800 pages and described plans for attacking thousands of targets across the Soviet Union, China, and Eastern Europe simultaneously. The single integrated operational plan, known by the acronym PSYOP, was the master nuclear war plan of the United States military. Its first version, completed in 1960, called for the simultaneous delivery of the entire American nuclear arsenal against targets in the Soviet Union, China, and Eastern Bloc nations in a single coordinated strike. The estimated casualties from the initial plan ran to hundreds of millions of people. What was striking about the PSYOP was not its destructive scale, which was understood, but the degree to which it constrained presidential decision-making. The plan was designed to be executed as a unit. It was difficult, and in early versions nearly impossible, to execute only a portion of it in response to a limited attack. A Soviet strike on a single American city would, under the original PSYOP, have triggered a response targeting the entire communist world. The inflexibility was not an oversight. It was a design feature intended to make the threat credible by making limited response genuinely difficult. The effect was a system in which the President of the United States had, in a meaningful operational sense, less control over the nuclear arsenal in a crisis than the plan suggested. Revisions over subsequent decades introduced more flexibility. The fundamental tension between flexibility and credibility was never resolved. The eighth technology was a submarine-launched ballistic missile program. But the specific detail that remained classified for decades was not the missiles themselves, but the procedures governing their use. American ballistic missile submarines operated under launch authority procedures that evolved considerably over the Cold War, but that consistently included provisions for what would happen if communications with the National Command Authority were lost. A submarine that could not receive orders could not function as a deterrent. But a submarine operating under orders that required positive presidential authorization for every launch was vulnerable to being neutralized by destroying communications links. The resolution of this tension involved procedural arrangements that allowed submarine commanders to make judgments about whether communications failure indicated a nuclear attack had occurred and whether to proceed with launch under those circumstances. The details of these arrangements remain partially classified. What is known is that submarine commanders operated under a set of conditions that gave them meaningful independent authority under specified circumstances, and that the existence of this authority was not publicly disclosed because its disclosure would have complicated both arms control negotiations and public understanding of civilian control over nuclear weapons. The ninth technology was an early warning system, and its most significant characteristic was the number of times it generated false alarms. The Ballistic Missile Early Warning System, known as BMEWS, was designed to provide 15 to 20 minutes of warning of a Soviet ICBM attack. This warning time was intended to allow the President and the National Command Authority to make a launch decision before incoming warheads destroyed American missile forces. What the system design created was a situation in which a 15-minute window, less time than it takes to hold a substantive conversation, governed decisions about responses that would kill tens of millions of people. The pressure to decide within that window created institutional incentives to act on incomplete information. In November 1979, a training tape simulating a Soviet missile attack was loaded into the NORAD computer system and generated a full-scale alert. For several minutes, American forces moved toward higher readiness states before the error was identified. In June 1980, a faulty computer chip generated repeated false missile attack warnings over a period of several days, each one triggering partial force readiness actions before being identified as erroneous. The 1983 Soviet false alarm incident, in which a Soviet early warning satellite misidentified reflected sunlight from cloud cover as American missile launches, came close to triggering a Soviet retaliatory strike. The Soviet duty officer, Stanislav Petrov, chose to report the alert as a system malfunction rather than a genuine attack. His reasoning that the system was showing 5 missiles rather than the hundreds expected in a genuine first strike was intuitive rather than procedural. He later said he was not certain he was right. He acted on a judgment that the institutional framework was not designed to accommodate. The 10th technology was a communication system designed to ensure that nuclear launch orders could be delivered even after the destruction of conventional command and control infrastructure. The Takamo aircraft, which stood for take charge and move out, were modified jet aircraft that trailed miles of very low-frequency antenna wire behind them as they flew, transmitting encoded launch orders to submerged submarines. The system was designed to function as a relay between surviving National Command Authority elements and the submarine fleet. Its existence was acknowledged. Its operational details were not. What the system represented in strategic terms was an attempt to solve the fundamental problem of nuclear command and control, ensuring that the decision to launch could be communicated to the forces that would execute it, while simultaneously ensuring that the decision could be made under conditions of extreme destruction and time pressure. The aircraft that carried this capability were, from the perspective of Soviet planners, extremely high-value targets. Destroying them would degrade American second strike capability. Protecting them required ensuring they could operate independently of the ground infrastructure that Soviet missiles would target first. The solution created a system that was, in a genuine operational sense, designed to function in a world in which almost everything else had already been destroyed. The 11th technology was a program of chemical and biological weapons research that the United States government officially terminated in 1969 and 1970, but whose scale and nature were not fully disclosed for many years afterward. The American Offensive Biological Weapons Program had, by the time of its termination, produced quantities of agents including anthrax, botulinum toxin, and several other pathogens sufficient to cause casualties at a scale comparable to nuclear weapons. The facilities at Pine Bluff Arsenal in Arkansas and Fort Detrick in Maryland had developed production, weaponization, and delivery capabilities that represented decades of institutional investment. When President Nixon ordered the program terminated, the destruction of existing stockpiles was documented. What was less clearly documented was the full extent of research that had been conducted, the nature of the agents that had been developed, and the degree to which knowledge and some materials may have survived the formal termination of the program in forms not covered by the destruction orders. The Soviet biological weapons program, which continued through the Cold War and beyond under the cover organization Biopreparat, was far larger and more sophisticated than American intelligence assessments indicated at the time. When Soviet defectors began providing detailed accounts of that program in the 1980s and 1990s, the gap between what American intelligence had believed and what the Soviets had actually accomplished proved to be substantial. The 12th technology was a nuclear artillery system deployed to Europe that represented one of the most significant and least publicly discussed elements of NATO's nuclear posture. The Davy Crockett was a recoilless rifle capable of firing a small nuclear warhead, and it was deployed to American Army units in West Germany in significant numbers during the early 1960s. The weapon had an effective range of roughly 2 miles. Its nuclear yield was small by strategic standards, but sufficient to destroy a concentration of armored vehicles or troops within its blast radius. The significance of the Davy Crockett was not its yield, but its deployment level. The weapon was issued to battalion-level Army units, which meant that the authority to use nuclear weapons was, in the operational plans of the early 1960s, distributed to a level of command far below what the public understood to be the case. Battalion commanders in West Germany had access to nuclear weapons. The procedures governing their use required authorization from higher authority, but the weapons were physically present at a level of command where the pressures of battlefield decision-making were most acute. The Davy Crockett was withdrawn from service in 1971. In part because its design was obsolete, and in part because the policy consensus around nuclear weapons use in Europe had shifted toward reduced reliance on battlefield nuclear weapons. The fact of its deployment remained for many years one of the least discussed aspects of NATO's Cold War nuclear posture. The 13th technology was a Soviet system designed to ensure that nuclear weapons could be launched even if the entire Soviet military and political leadership had been destroyed. Dead Hand, known in Russian as Perimeter, was a semi-automated nuclear launch system that could, under the right trigger conditions, issue launch commands to Soviet ballistic missiles without human authorization. The system worked as follows. Seismic sensors, radiation detectors, and atmospheric pressure monitors were linked to a command system that continuously assessed whether a nuclear attack was in progress. If those sensors indicated a nuclear detonation had occurred on Soviet territory, and if the system could not reach human commanders in the Soviet military hierarchy, a special rocket was launched. That rocket flew over Soviet territory, transmitting launch commands directly to missiles in their silos. The missiles would then launch automatically. The existence of Perimeter was not acknowledged by the Soviet government until 1993. 2 years after the Soviet Union had ceased to exist. American intelligence had suspected the existence of such a system, but had not confirmed it. The implications of its existence were significant. It meant that a nuclear exchange, once initiated, could continue without any human decision-making on the Soviet side. It meant that the escalation ladder that strategic theorists had spent decades designing, with its carefully calibrated rungs of increasing pressure and corresponding response options, could be bypassed entirely by a system that responded to physical evidence of attack rather than political decisions about response. The system was reportedly still operational after the Soviet Union's dissolution. Whether it remains operational in some form under current Russian nuclear forces is not publicly known. The 14th technology was a program of intelligence collection that operated by inserting American personnel and equipment inside Soviet territory without the Soviet government's knowledge in ways that went considerably beyond conventional aerial or satellite reconnaissance. The details of some of these programs remain classified. What has been declassified includes elements of a Navy program that tapped Soviet undersea communications cables in the Sea of Okhotsk, placing recording devices directly on cables connecting Soviet Pacific Fleet installations. Operation Ivy Bells placed tape recorders on a cable that carried, in unencrypted form, communications between Soviet naval facilities on Sakhalin Island and the Soviet Pacific Fleet headquarters at Vladivostok. American submarines approached and divers attached the recording devices, which were periodically recovered and replaced. The operation ran for approximately a decade before being compromised by a National Security Agency employee who sold information about it to the Soviet Union. What the Ivy Bells operation represented was not simply an intelligence success, but an illustration of the degree to which American intelligence operations had penetrated Soviet military infrastructure in ways that Soviet security services did not detect for years. The corresponding question, which the available record does not fully answer, is the degree to which Soviet intelligence had achieved comparable penetrations of American military infrastructure that remained undetected for comparable periods. The 15th technology was a series of nuclear weapon safety devices whose inadequacy was not publicly acknowledged until decades after the weapons they were supposed to protect had been retired. The Permissive Action Link, known as PAL, was a coded switch system designed to prevent nuclear weapons from being armed and detonated without proper authorization codes. The system was technically straightforward in concept and genuinely important in practice. The problem was that the deployment of PAL technology lagged the deployment of the weapons it was meant to protect. American nuclear weapons were deployed in the 1950s and into the 1960s with safety systems that were far less sophisticated than subsequent accounts of Cold War nuclear security implied. Some weapons had mechanical safeguards that could be bypassed under certain conditions. Some were stored in configurations that made unauthorized use more feasible than official safety doctrine acknowledged. A study conducted in the 1960s and later partially declassified found that certain tactical nuclear weapons deployed with NATO forces in Europe were configured in ways that created meaningful risk of unauthorized use. The response to this finding was institutional and gradual, rather than immediate and comprehensive, which meant that weapons with inadequate safety systems remained deployed, while negotiations about retrofitting them proceeded through the same bureaucratic channels that governed all other aspects of nuclear weapons management. The 16th technology was a program of directed energy weapons research that produced operational systems decades before the public understood such systems to be feasible. The Soviet Union invested heavily in high-energy laser technology throughout the Cold War, and by the 1980s had developed ground-based laser systems capable of temporarily blinding or permanently damaging the optical sensors of American reconnaissance satellites. The existence of these systems was known to American intelligence but not publicly acknowledged, because acknowledging them would have required acknowledging either the vulnerability of American satellite assets or the intelligence methods by which information about Soviet capabilities was obtained. The Soviet laser systems represented a significant capability in the context of a conflict that depended heavily on satellite-based reconnaissance and early warning. Blinding the senses of an early warning satellite at a critical moment could create a gap in American situational awareness precisely when situational awareness mattered most. The Soviet program also included research into more powerful systems capable of destroying rather than merely blinding satellite sensors, and into space-based platforms that could deliver directed energy against targets in orbit or on the ground. The full extent of these programs remains partially classified on the American side because the intelligence methods used to monitor them have not been fully disclosed. The 17th technology was a nuclear weapons storage and deployment program in Europe, whose geographic scope was far broader than the public understood. During the height of the Cold War, American nuclear weapons were stored not only in the major NATO countries whose nuclear role was publicly acknowledged, but in a considerably larger number of locations, including some that were never publicly confirmed and some that have been confirmed only through the gradual process of declassification and investigative journalism over the past 3 decades. American nuclear weapons were stored in Greece, Turkey, South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, Morocco, and a number of other locations that represented a global deployment footprint that the United States government consistently declined to describe in public. The political sensitivity of this deployment pattern was significant. Host governments had varying degrees of awareness of and control over the weapons on their territory. Some host country governments were fully informed and had negotiated arrangements governing the weapons. Others were in more ambiguous positions. The procedural arrangements governing these weapons, including the question of who had physical custody and who had authority to use them, varied by location and period. The full picture of this deployment pattern remains, in some details, classified. The 18th technology was a program of research into the effects of nuclear weapons on human physiology that was conducted in part through experiments on human subjects who were not fully informed of the nature of the research. The American nuclear weapons program generated, as a byproduct of weapons development and testing, a large body of classified research into the effects of radiation exposure on human health. Some of this research was conducted on military personnel present at nuclear tests, who were exposed to radiation in conditions that allowed researchers to document the health effects. Some was conducted on civilian populations downwind of test sites, whose exposure was monitored without their full knowledge or consent. The classified nature of the research meant that individuals who developed radiation-related health problems after exposure at test sites faced official denials that their exposure had occurred at levels sufficient to cause harm, denials that were in some cases factually incorrect based on the classified data the government possessed. The declassification of much of this research, which occurred gradually from the 1980s onward, revealed a pattern in which institutional interest in maintaining the secrecy of the testing program had taken precedence over the health interests of exposed individuals. This pattern was not unique to the United States. Soviet nuclear testing at Semipalatinsk in Kazakhstan produced comparable health effects in the surrounding population, and the Soviet government's handling of that information followed a similar pattern of institutional prioritization of secrecy over disclosure. The 19th technology was a system of command and control arrangements that governed the Soviet nuclear arsenal, and whose full details became known to Western analysts only after the Soviet Union's dissolution, when former Soviet officials began providing accounts that differed in significant ways from the picture that American intelligence had constructed. The Soviet nuclear command system included arrangements for devolving launch authority under conditions of attack that were, in some respects, more permissive than American analysts had believed. The Soviet military's concern about the survivability of its command and control infrastructure had produced contingency arrangements that allowed lower-level commanders to take actions under specified conditions without explicit authorization from the political leadership. The extent to which these arrangements may have been triggered, or nearly triggered, during the various crises and confrontations of the Cold War is not fully known. What is known is that the American intelligence picture of Soviet command and control was, on several significant points, incorrect, and that the planning and crisis management decisions made on the basis of that picture were therefore based on assumptions about Soviet decision-making that did not accurately reflect how Soviet nuclear forces actually operated. What connects these 19 programs is not simply that they were secret, though most of them were. What connects them is that each one represents a point at which the institutional systems of the Cold War operated in ways that the people nominally in charge of those systems did not fully understand or could not fully control. The presidents and general secretaries who presided over the Cold War were, in a genuine operational sense, managers of systems too large and too complex for any individual or small group to comprehend in their entirety. The decisions that mattered most were often made at levels far removed from the people whose names appear in the historical record. The technologies that came closest to causing catastrophe were not the ones that attracted the most political attention. They were the ones that operated quietly, at the margins of official awareness, governed by procedures that had been designed to function without oversight, because oversight had been identified as a vulnerability. The near misses of the Cold War were not, in the main, the product of miscalculation by political leaders. They were the product of systems designed to respond faster than political leadership could act, encountering circumstances that those systems were not designed to handle. The false alarm at NORAD in 1979 was not a failure of political judgment. It was a failure of a tape management procedure. The Soviet early warning alert of 1983 was not a failure of strategic thinking. It was a failure of satellite sensor calibration, combined with a situation where the duty officer's institutional instructions and his personal judgment pointed in different directions, and where his personal judgment happened to be correct. The Goldsboro near miss was not a failure of presidential decision-making. It was a failure of an arms safeguard switch in a weapon that had been cleared as safe for airborne alert operations. The pattern that emerges from the full classified record, as much of it as has become available through declassification and historical research, is not a story of enemies who came close to destroying each other through hatred or aggression. It is a story of systems that were designed to operate at the edge of human decision-making, and that, on multiple occasions, operated beyond that edge without the knowledge of the people who were supposed to be in control. The catastrophe that did not happen was not primarily the product of wisdom or statesmanship, though there were moments when wisdom and statesmanship mattered. It was primarily the product of mechanical and procedural failures that happened to fail in the safe direction, combined with the individual judgments of people like Stanislav Petrov, who were in positions to act on incomplete information and happened to act correctly. The Cold War ended in 1991, when the Soviet Union dissolved. The treaties that had governed the competition between the two superpowers remained in force in modified forms. The weapons that had been built to fight the war remained deployed, in reduced but still substantial numbers. The command and control systems that had been designed to manage those weapons continued to operate. The early warning satellites continued to scan for missile launches. The submarines continued to patrol. The planning staffs continued to maintain operational plans. The institutional knowledge accumulated over 40 years of weapons development and strategic planning did not evaporate when the flags changed. It was inherited by successor organizations in successor states, carrying with it the procedures and assumptions and contingency arrangements that had been developed in a context that no longer existed, applied to a strategic situation that no one had fully thought through. The systems built to manage the Cold War outlasted the Cold War. They are still operating. The warheads in their silos were not designed with an expiration date. The submarines on patrol were not built to stop when a political arrangement changed. The command authority procedures, the authenticated launch codes, the permissive action links and their successor systems, the early warning networks watching the skies and the ocean floor and the electromagnetic spectrum simultaneously, none of these were designed to stand down because a country ceased to exist. They were designed to persist. Persistence was the point. A system that could be shut down by political change could theoretically be shut down by an adversary who engineered that political change. The logic of deterrence required that the weapons continue to function regardless of the political context in which they had been built. When the Soviet Union dissolved in December 1991, the nuclear arsenal it left behind was distributed across 4 newly independent states: Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. The command and control infrastructure that governed those weapons had been built around a single centralized authority that no longer existed. The procedural arrangements for authenticating launch orders, for maintaining the chain of custody over nuclear materials, for ensuring that the weapons could not be used without proper authorization, all of these depended on institutional structures that were in the process of collapsing. The period between the formal dissolution of the Soviet Union and the completion of arrangements to consolidate the non-Russian arsenal under Russian control was, by any reasonable assessment, a period of elevated risk. Weapons that had been built to ensure the destruction of the United States were, for a period of years, in the custody of states whose political stability was uncertain and whose relationship with the institutional infrastructure of the Soviet nuclear program was complicated. The Budapest Memorandum of 1994, under which Ukraine, Belarus and Kazakhstan agreed to transfer their nuclear weapons to Russia in exchange for security assurances from the United States, the United Kingdom and Russia, was presented at the time as a non-proliferation success. It was also a stark illustration of the degree to which the end of the Cold War had not ended the problems the Cold War had created. 3 newly independent states had nuclear weapons on their territory, not because they had chosen to acquire them, but because the country that had built them had ceased to exist. The resolution of this situation required years of negotiation, significant financial incentives, and a set of security assurances whose value was tested in ways that will not be described here because they fall outside the period this narration addresses. The point is that the systems built to fight a war did not dissolve when the political context for that war dissolved. They required active, sustained effort to manage, and the management was imperfect. The technologies described in this narration were not historical curiosities. They were the operational infrastructure of the most dangerous sustained competition in recorded history, and the people who built them understood, at least in the abstract, what they had created. The scientists who designed the weapons, the engineers who built the command and control systems, the military planners who wrote the operational plans, the intelligence analysts who assessed the adversary's capabilities, all of these people worked within institutions that had evolved specifically to manage the discomfort of knowing what they knew. Compartmentalization was not simply a security measure, it was a psychological management tool. If no single person had to hold in their mind simultaneously the full picture of what the system was capable of, then the full picture never had to be confronted directly by any individual conscience. The result was a system that was, collectively, capable of things that none of its individual components would have endorsed in isolation. The battalion commander in West Germany who had custody of a Davy Crockett was a professional soldier following established procedures. The officer on duty at NORAD who responded to the 1979 false alarm was a trained professional executing a response protocol. The naval officer who supervised the placement of recording devices on Soviet communications cables was carrying out an authorized intelligence operation. None of them were operating outside their institutional roles. All of them were nodes in a system whose full dimensions none of them could see. This is what the Cold War actually was, at its operational level. It was not a confrontation between two ideologies, though it was also that. It was not a competition between two economic systems, though it was also that. At its most fundamental operational level, it was a set of systems built to respond to other systems, each one calibrated to the behavior of its counterpart, each one carrying within its design assumptions about what the other side would do under specified conditions. The assumptions were sometimes wrong. The conditions sometimes arose. The responses sometimes came very close to triggering the responses they were designed to deter. The Cuban Missile Crisis is the event in this history that received the most public attention, and it illustrates the pattern clearly. The 13 days of visible crisis, the ExComm meetings, the naval quarantine, the diplomatic exchanges that ultimately produced a resolution. These were the surface of an event whose operational dimensions were considerably more complicated. During those 13 days, a Soviet submarine in the Caribbean, the B-59, lost communications with Moscow and came under attack by American naval forces using practiced depth charges intended to signal the submarine to surface. The submarine's captain believed, in the absence of communications, that war might already have begun. The submarine carried a nuclear torpedo. The procedures governing its use required agreement from 3 officers: the captain, the political officer, and the executive officer. The captain and the political officer voted to use the weapon. The executive officer, Vasily Arkhipov, voted against. The weapon was not used. If the vote had gone the other way, the course of the crisis would have changed in ways that are genuinely difficult to predict. But that would almost certainly not have remained within the boundaries of the diplomatic resolution that was being negotiated on the surface. This story became known in the West in 2002, more than 4 decades after the event. It was not a story that either government had any interest in publicizing at the time. The Soviet government could not acknowledge that its submarine commander had nearly launched a nuclear weapon without proper authorization. The American government could not acknowledge that its anti-submarine forces had driven a Soviet submarine to the point where its commander believed war had already begun. The story was classified on both sides because both sides found its disclosure politically damaging. In the meantime, it remained unknown to the public that lived through the resolution of the crisis and believed, on the basis of what had been disclosed, that rational calculation had prevailed. The classified record of the Cold War is full of stories like this one. They are stories of events that came close to changing the course of history in ways that the official narrative of the period does not reflect. They are stories of systems functioning as designed under conditions the designers had not anticipated, producing outcomes that were in some cases fortunate and in others costly, and in a few very nearly catastrophic. They are stories of institutional silence maintained for reasons that were, individually, comprehensible and, collectively, corrosive to any honest accounting of what had actually occurred. The bureaucratic machinery that managed the Cold War was extraordinarily sophisticated at one specific task, which was the management of information about itself. Classification systems, compartmentalization procedures, cover stories, official denials, carefully worded public statements that were technically accurate while being substantively misleading. These were not incidental features of Cold War governance. They were its primary institutional product. The weapons were the instruments. The secrecy was the operating system, and the operating system did not shut down when the Cold War ended. It had been running for too long, and its roots were too deep in the institutional structures of the governments that had built it to be dismantled by political decision. Declassification programs released portions of the record, but the selection of what to release and what to continue to withhold was itself an exercise of the same institutional judgment that had governed classification decisions throughout the Cold War. The picture that emerged from 4 decades of gradual declassification was more complete than what had been available before, but it was still a managed disclosure, still shaped by assessments of what could be released without compromising ongoing capabilities, ongoing relationships, ongoing institutional interests. The men and women who spent their careers inside this system were not, by and large, people who believed they were doing wrong. They believed they were managing an extraordinarily dangerous situation with the tools available to them, and that the management of the danger required the management of information about the danger. They were not wrong that the situation was dangerous. Whether the management of information about it served the interests of the populations on whose behalf it was conducted is a different question, and not one that the system itself was designed to answer. The technologies described in this narration were the material expression of a set of decisions made over roughly 4 decades about how to organize the relationship between 2 nuclear-armed states that regarded each other as existential threats. Each technology represented a choice, and each choice created conditions that subsequent choices had to accommodate. The hydrophone arrays on the ocean floor created pressure on Soviet submarine doctrine. The Soviet submarine doctrine created pressure on American anti-submarine warfare capabilities. The American anti-submarine warfare capabilities created pressure on Soviet early warning systems. Each response to a perceived vulnerability created new vulnerabilities that required new responses. The system was self-generating, not because anyone designed it to be, but because the logic of deterrence, pursued consistently by both sides, produced that result automatically. What the classified record ultimately reveals is that the Cold War was not primarily a conflict between 2 states. It was a conflict between 2 systems that had each evolved to respond to the other, and that in the process of that evolution had developed capabilities and operational procedures that their nominal overseers did not fully understand or control. The presidents who held the nuclear codes did not fully understand the systems those codes were embedded in. The general secretaries who received briefings on nuclear posture did not fully understand the operational details of the forces those briefings described. The gap between the political understanding of the nuclear competition and its operational reality was not a failure of intelligence or preparation. It was a structural feature of systems too large and too complex to be held in any single mind. The Cold War ended without resolving this condition. The systems that had been built to manage the competition between 2 superpowers continued to operate after one of those superpowers ceased to exist, managed now by institutions in successor states that were themselves navigating the gap between inherited systems and new political realities. The weapons remained. The procedures remained. The institutional cultures that had been built around managing those weapons and those procedures remained. What changed was the political context. And the political context had always been, from the perspective of the systems themselves, secondary to the operational logic that governed their design. The systems built to manage the Cold War outlasted the Cold War. They are still operating,